You're listening to, oh wait, what was it again? The Geekly Chronicles, and you'll get it in the end.
Now, life in lockdown is hard for a lot of us, but for the LGBTQ plus community, and trans folks in particular, it presents a fresh set of challenges. Combine that with a tightening of laws and a negative change to government rhetoric on trans issues, it's an interesting time for trans folks like me. But rather than just talk about my own opinions, Catherine and I thought it might be great to invite some friends from the wider trans community over for a virtual cuppa and a chat by the fire. So while Catherine gets the custard creams, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Ben Saunders, Jane Fay, V Wegman, and Jacob Edwards. Welcome to the show, everyone!
Hello!
You are all so unbelievably amazing. Why don't you introduce yourselves to our lovely listeners?
Yeah, I'm Ben. I use he, him pronouns. I'm an activist and filmmaker.
Hi, I'm Jane Fay. I'm she, her, or occasionally when I'm feeling particularly elvish, I'm Fay Fair. I'm a writer, occasional stand-up, and probably just about does it.
Hi, I'm Jacob Edward. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a radio presenter. I was the first non-binary person to present a show on Radio 1.
I'm V Wegman. I use they, them pronouns. If you can't tell from my accent, I'm a Midwestern American, and I had the absolute fortune of being a 3-time NASA intern. I am currently furloughed at the Carnegie Science Center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
So, I've never been an intern at NASA, but I have noticed that in my own experience, there's a huge crossover of trans people and techie people. My first question to you all is, would you consider yourself a geek? And what are you the most geeky about?
I'm not totally sure what you mean by geek. I'm not incredibly techie, but I've always seen myself as a bridge, a sort of crossover between tech and non-tech. I suppose I do get quite geeky about stats, statistics, because I've written a couple of books on the subject. And my main focus is the intersection of IT and the law, where I think the government's not just got it wrong, but is actively doing damage to the LGBT community.
Wow, I mean, that's incredible. And I would say that definitely qualifies as a geeky passion.
Oh, damn.
I'm not sure if I'd describe myself as a geek, but I think in some ways a little bit of like a nerd. I'm not with tech, but with like history. I collect a lot of like old photos and like old newspapers and stuff like that. So if that qualifies me to be like a nerd geek in some way.
100%. It is a main part of my personality. Not just space, but I'm very geeky about Star Wars, animation, art in general. I'm definitely a fan of history as well. But yeah, anything science, and that includes the art of science. I'm a big fan of the creative side of science, and that's why I do what I do.
I am 100% a geek, whether I like to admit it all the time or not. I love a bit of sci-fi, me. I used to live for Star Wars, Doctor Who, all that kind of thing. And I still do. I still dabble in it, but I'm not like a hardcore geek. I don't even know how to describe it. I'm just existing in a plane of geekiness constantly.
Oh, wonderful. Obviously, this is a tough time for the LGBTQ plus community and trans people in particular. What are your tips for coping during these strange times?
So something that helped me when I was feeling somewhat isolated, younger in my coming out phase, growing up in a small town with not much of an LGBTQ community at all. While I am back in that hometown right now, it is easier for me to connect to the community through the glorious internet. So I highly suggest getting involved in social communities. Back then I used Tumblr. Now I think Twitter has sort of taken on that role of being a source of community, and we have Discord as well to find community there. So finding a virtual community, that is my best advice. As much self-care as you can by giving yourself as much compassion and forgiveness.
That's lovely.
Food. So much food. What I've been doing is just eating constantly. All the snacks, all the Easter eggs.
Well, yeah. I mean, my own take on this is, I suppose I have some perspective because I'm ancient and so on. So I've seen where we've come from, and I'm also very aware that a lot of what's going on right now is hot air. It's people talking and making themselves feel good about being anti-trans. But what I would say to younger members of the trans community, look at what you've done. Not necessarily any individual, but just stop and take stock. And no one of you have done it all. All of you together, you are strong, you are proud. And yes, sometimes we fall back. There's always somebody else to pick up the flag and move forward. And together, you never are truly defeated. And that's what I believe.
Oh, I felt that. Thank you, Jane.
That's so beautiful, Jane.
I think as well, like Twitter is like a big thing for me at the moment, like particularly at the moment, because it's kind of like a support network and kind of it's just such a supportive environment if you choose the right kind of side of Twitter, especially like in isolation at the moment. Like Twitter and things is one of the only ways that I'm kind of being addressed with like the correct pronouns and things a lot at the moment is quite helpful and quite supportive.
Yeah, Twitter has certainly been a lifeline for me over the years, far more so, I would say, than any other social network. Thank you, Ben, for reminding us all. Let's change the tone slightly. While the world at large may have missed it, very few trans people will have escaped the recent announcement from Liz Truss, the UK's Equalities Minister, that she plans to restrict the rights of trans young people in the UK. I wonder if you'd all share your thoughts.
Oh, well, this is just fringe ministers and politicians playing with anti-trans rhetoric because it wins them some brownie points on the wilder reaches of the Christian right. It worries me, but I'm not that worried because so far I don't think there's any substance to this, any meat. But it is causing people to be scared, and I think that if government cared, ministers need to engage their heart and their brain before they spout absolute nonsense like this.
I think it's awful, but I am not surprised. I felt like something like this would happen. I know something's been going on in Brazil quite recently with regard to trans rights, and it just seems like the thing that they're doing now that there's a global crisis, they're like, we can slip this in under the carpet and nobody will notice. So that was my initial thoughts, was just feeling sick and not knowing how to help or what to do.
I only just turned 18 back in October. If I'd been born like a year or two later, then this would be directly affecting me rather than indirectly. I think after having read what she said and things, like it seems very contradictory. Like she said at one point, like she wants trans people to feel safe from like harassment and hate crime and things, but at the same time coming out and saying like, oh, we're gonna take away this for young trans people and this and things, it sends a message completely to the public because now we're having, in quotation marks, debates, and that in itself makes all trans people not safe from harassment. If you look at wider healthcare, under 16, you're given control of your body in terms of like contraception, cosmetic surgeries and things, like in quite a few ways. And if you start to take away that control and that rights for young trans people, then that's almost like set a dangerous precedent and like a slippery slope in a way to taking it away from everybody. So it's quite scary for everything, really.
Yeah, I think this does feed into what I wanted to say, which is, firstly, there's an enormous amount of media misinformation. But the other thing which I think people need to say, and absolutely need to be calling her out on, is this is a stalking horse. This is a stalking horse for something else, for Christian right, for those people who want to clamp down on the rights of younger people and who want to clamp down on the right of women to control their own fertility. And I think what people need to do, I will be researching this, but if anyone else gets there before me, they're free to do so. Look at her record on abortion. She's very, very cagey about it. And the point is, if you strip away rights from young trans people because you don't want them taking what she would call irreversible decisions, what then happens to young people's rights to contraception? What happens to young people's rights to abortion? And my own take is that this is a very, very dangerous, very right-wing agenda to roll back rights that young women particularly have managed to achieve.
V, as someone looking at the UK from the outside and obviously having to deal with a whole different set of laws and prejudices in your own country, how does this feel to you?
It seems slightly discouraging. I will say, though, that it has not made major news over here. However, being as involved in the online community as I am, I have seen much about it, and I did read her brief and gave it quite a bit of thought and read a lot of my mutual Twitter folks, their responses. And what they've said, especially coming from Equalities Minister, incredibly discouraging. And as you said, Ben, the logic is a fallacy. It's all well and good to promote the consent aspect of things. However, in this case, it is far more dangerous to revoke any sense of consent and choice. Harping on what you said, Jane, giving that choice to what you can do with your body. Having someone who's supposed to be your cheerleader in the ministry not supporting your freedom in that, it's scary and disappointing.
Thank you for sharing all those amazing thoughts. It feels weird to have to say this, but surely our rights should be respected the world over, right? But between what's happening in the UK, the rise of Viktor Orban's right-wing regime in Hungary, and the general disparity of trans rights across the United States and the world in general, there's a lot for us to think about right now, isn't there?
There's so much to think about. I don't even know how to comprehend the hate towards us. I don't quite understand why people hate us. What's the threat? I mean, we are just people trying to live our lives authentically, and it's already hard enough.
Yeah, it's an odd one. I get quite involved in politics, what goes on in Italy and some parts of Europe. And next week, Italy will be celebrating the end of Mussolini. And those who know their history will know that he ended very badly indeed. And Europe has a habit of dealing with dictators and dealing with far-right people. And they don't end pleasantly. And I look around, the one which really worries me right now is Orban in Hungary. But however bad Orban is and his attempt to outlaw being transgender, my suspicion is he's beginning to reach the end of his sell-by date. It may sound melodramatic. When it comes, it's going to come very quickly, and he may not be standing at the end of it, because he's pursuing policies which are based on pure hatred. The populace don't see an issue with trans people, but he has picked on us as a way of going along with the far-right agenda. I think it'll end badly for him.
Thank you, Jane. That is a really interesting point. The distinction between ignorance and out-and-out transphobia is a really interesting one to look at in general. I think it's safe to say that we've all experienced our fair share of both. Which do you find that you have to deal with more on a day-to-day basis?
I have encountered transphobia on a number of occasions, but I wouldn't say it's like a day-to-day thing. Like, the majority of people don't care. But one thing I have found quite a lot is that just generally on a day-to-day basis, a lot of people just don't know. They might misgender me, but it's not because, they're transphobic. It's just because they actually don't know. Like, they've never heard of what it is or met someone who's trans or know quite what to say, or then they overthink it and say the wrong things and whatever. But I think from my perspective, in this country, there's a big issue of people not being educated on what it is, so not understanding. So therefore, for example, if there's like wrong information put online or on TV or whatever, then they're more likely to believe that if that's all they're hearing.
And V, how does that match with things in your part of the world?
Yeah, mine is pretty close to Ben's in that, I'm an AFAB person and I get misgendered often, especially as a non-binary trans person as well. Explaining the they, them pronoun thing is still quite a challenge for me. I've only really known about non-binary people as an existence for the past 4 years and immediately found a sense of community with that identity. And still trying to keep up with correcting people is quite difficult. So facing transphobia is not as violent as it could be for me. And certainly in my job, I have a very lovely set of coworkers that have never given it any sort of thought as to be negative about it and have only been supportive. So I've been quite fortunate in that sense where I have not faced violent transphobia. It's just been small things like using women's restrooms, which is my preference, being asked to leave or being yelled at by moms, those small things, but that hasn't happened in a little while at this point.
I have a feeling it's mainly ignorance from the LGBT community or the LGB community, cis LGB people. A lot of people that worked at Gadio before me hadn't met a non-binary person before, let alone had one on air. So that was a whole thing. I remember it was quite a thing just having presenters throw forward to me and being like, here's Jacob, he's on air next. And I'm like, no, that's not how we do that. It took a lot of time. I remember like clearly when the emails started going out about new presenters and new shows, and even the current crisis, they've put every presenter's pronouns on all the emails now. So it's like whenever you're throwing forward, you've got that there, and it's such a good step forward.
Oh, thank you, Jacob V. There are some really great points there about acceptance from employers. Time and time again, I see online fellow trans people getting asked to educate and explain their own existence. How do you feel about that? Is it our responsibility?
I think it's very problematic. It shouldn't be our job, but I end up thinking, if not us, who the hell is going to do it? Because I write extensively, because I'm a trustee of Transmedia Watch. I look at the media, and the media has given over to pure sensationalism. It's all about clickbait, and it's all about making money by riling people up. That is exactly the problem of what I was alluding to earlier with the Liz Truss story. We have one of the major national news networks in the UK suggesting that part of this story is about trans people no longer being able to get, or her trying to stop trans people from getting gender reassignment surgery before the age of 18. It's utter nonsense. The problem is that we are a quite small minority in terms of active components, we are here trying to combat that against the entire weight of the national press. It's very difficult.
It's tiring. It's quite sad that it's one of those things where it just is a part of being trans in a way, having to kind of answer those questions for people because you kind of feel as if, well, if I don't, then who will? One of the things that upsets me quite a bit sometimes is if I encounter someone, a mutual friend or someone who misgenders me, or like on a number of occasions, or generally a bit like ignorant to trans identities, and if that person isn't called out by like the people that I'm with or something, then I feel like it's my responsibility to then have to correct them, and that is quite tough. It's just quite tiring. It's nice to have someone else stand up for you every so often and kind of do that job for you, because when you get misgendered, it's like getting slapped in the face in a way, because you don't have anything to say back to it. So you either just take it or hope that someone else says something for you. But yeah, it is quite tiring having to always be like a spokesperson and kind of make sure that what you're saying is somehow reflective of every single trans person in the whole country. And it's quite a weight.
I'm so bad at educating people. I mean, I feel like people think I'm speaking on behalf of everyone else, and I'm not. I'm literally speaking from my own experience. And that's especially true for non-binary people, because we're all so different. There's just not one way to describe being non-binary. Like, somebody else's definition is different to mine, and I'm not entirely sure how to put my existence into words at the best of times. And so being asked to educate people is really tough. Like, when I had finally come to terms with me being non-binary and using they them pronouns, I couldn't actually say it to my parents. I literally had to send them an email with 3 articles about non-binary people. These articles were brilliant. They described it perfectly, but I just couldn't do that. I still couldn't put it quite into words that they would understand. I needed them to listen to the articles, read them, and digest them before speaking to me, because I was just like, I don't know. I don't really know how to educate people.
Well, I'm sure, Jacob, you're not alone in having come out via letter, and educating even the best LGBTQ plus ally is hard, especially if you're related to them. So let's talk a little about allies for a second. How important do you think they are to helping make the world safer for trans adults, trans young people, and our broad intersectional community in general?
We can't build visibility without their support. Otherwise, we're just this tiny little coalition of people shouting for acceptance, and we can't get acceptance without people outside our bubble. Yeah, we just want to be ourselves and be able to be ourselves within the larger community of anywhere, being able to exist without persecution or question.
For starters, if we had allies in the actual government, they wouldn't be trying to pass laws to try and restrict our rights. I think that's a pretty good place to start, because as an ally, you are there to support a community, even though you're not necessarily a part of that community. You are there to uplift them and protect them with things like laws. So being an ally in the government, very important, but also being an ally in real life, just correcting people when somebody gets misgendered. I've had people tell me so many times of just failings of people to stand up for trans people being misgendered. Even in LGBT spaces, like, people get misgendered, and if you don't stand up for your trans friends, sometimes it's not always something that they feel they can do. I am shocking at correcting people when they misgender me. Even though this is my identity and I've been out for years, it's still really, really tough.
Oh, absolutely. I have two thoughts about allies. The first is that allies are absolutely needed, but the second is they need to understand what it is they're signing up for and what it is that we want, because there is also a sort of bad ally phase that people can go through where they get a little bit out of control. And I think that can be problematic. I have seen allies start to lecture trans people about, well, what you should really be doing is this, and what you need is this. And that it's bad enough having to put up with the people who don't like us, who hate us even. When people are supposedly on your side start telling you what to do, then I think that is even worse.
Obviously, like, allies are great, but I think it's important for allies to kind of use their platform as an ally to give a voice to trans people, to kind of listen to what would actually help trans people, and, like, for instance, correcting people when you get misgendered, or standing up for the things that you're trying to stand up for but you're not being heard about. I think it's important to not shout over trans people as an ally.
Thank you all so much for your thoughts on these really important but really hard-hitting topics. I'm sure it's brought so much hope to so many of our trans listeners. And thinking of positivity, I'd really like to move on now and talk about some of your favourite trans success stories in the world right now. What have you seen that has really warmed your heart lately?
I have a good one. I live in Pennsylvania, and my Secretary of Health for the Pennsylvania state government is the one leading our COVID-19 response, and she is a trans woman. Her name is Dr. Rachel Levine, and she has done an absolute fantastic job. Dr. Rachel Levine has been wonderful and been a very steady source of confidence and information for not just Pennsylvania, but has been used across the U.S. for better health and risk information. And she happens to be a trans woman. It's wonderful. It makes me proud of my state.
Yeah, I've got a success story, and it's a lesson, I think. Success story, it's from Australia, and there, the usual suspects agitating. They want an inquiry into trans healthcare, particularly of trans children. And this week, the Australian Health Minister said no, that they would support medics in giving proper individual care to people, but it was not the government's role to be stepping in and carrying out any sort of inquiry like this. That is in sharp contrast to the likes of Liz Truss that we were talking about earlier. It's also, I think, a very good lesson in how to stop this sort of thing, because what we've seen over the last couple of years with the Gender Recognition Act is the government made this vague announcement they were going to do something about it, and then they didn't really do anything. They just created a vacuum. I think what is very clear is that when government does make a clear statement about what it wants to do, then it does shut down a lot of the hatred.
Well, something that I've been involved in is this little thing called the validation station. And Kestrel, I'm going to call you the project lead on this, because you sort of took the idea and ran with it. And then we got a whole team going. And it's just an incredible little service which sends a text message to a trans person or a cis person with their name and pronouns. And it's just a cute little affirming message every single day, just to remind them that their identity is valid. It's okay to be trans, because it can be really hard, especially if you're living with parents that aren't supportive, or family, or even housemates that aren't supportive of your identity. It's just good to hear your name and pronouns used in a sentence at least once a day.
Last but not least, a bit of a cliche question right now, but hey, what is your absolute top tip for surviving and thriving during the lockdown?
My mantra has been practicing relentless compassion, not just for your fellow human beings and other inhabitants of this planet, but for yourself, especially during this time. Forgiving yourself if you're not being uber productive during this time. And if in fact, you are feeling miserable, you're allowed to feel miserable, especially right now. We are in a miserable time. Give yourself the compassion that you would your best friend for having a rough day or a rough month, as it has been a very, very rough month.
I totally concur with that. I think I cheat a little bit because I'm finding it quite comfortable, and that's partly because I spent a lot of time trying to say I want to step back and do less of certain things, and this has made me do that. Don't set yourself ludicrous objectives, and the other thing, which is an absolute godsend, is share your life with a cat.
I said food earlier, but my other top tip is stay connected. You never know what somebody's going through, and so you texting them on that day might give them that sort of ray of sunshine that they needed. So just stay in touch with people, even if you're just acquaintances. Keep in touch. Just drop them a little message now and again.
I'm pretty much the same, being kind to yourself. I've been doing this thing where I have like a little notebook, and at the end of each day, like just before I go to sleep, no matter how good or bad the day's been, I've been forcing myself to write down like one positive thing from that day, even if it was like the worst day and all I did was like have a shower.
Jane, Ben, V, Jacob, thank you all so much for joining us and being a part of the show this evening. Just before you go, where can our listeners find you online if they'd like to keep up with you after the show?
Twitter's probably the easiest. I mean, if you're polite and nice to me, I might then from Twitter give you other details, but like I said, being nice and polite helps. It's Jane Faye, Janefae. There is no Y in Faye, despite the fact everyone keeps trying to put a Y in there.
My Twitter is Ben Saunders 44. That's probably the easiest.
Yeah, my Twitter is at VWEGS, so VWEGS.
You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, in fact, it's on everything, at It's Jacob Edward.
Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.